I'm Andrea Calderaro, indeed. I'm a fellow here at the UI. I'm a reader in international relations at Cardiff University. Reader is the awkward way a British defined associate professor in the UK system. And as an IR scholar, they've been always working on digital technologies. They look at how actors interact with each other in order to make the digital transformations that we are experiencing these days as much sustainable as possible. I refer to actors because, of course, in the IR domain, international relations domain, we mostly refer as state actors, but when it comes to digital technology specifically, that's what we're gonna discuss today, we have to deal a lot also with other actors beyond state actors. We need to deal with civil society organizations and industry that I guess many of you also represents today. In order to try to make as much evident as possible, they need to discuss cybersecurity beyond the national strategies, beyond national regulations, legislations that I assume you've been talking about over the last 3 days. I always like to start by showing the map of internet submarine cables. And this is always useful because it reminds us that the internet is transnational. It's transnational because of its hardware, and it's transnational because of its software. The hardware dimension is really made of internet submarine cables. And internet submarine cables lay on seabed in international sea waters. And this is a technical solution that has been implemented exactly not to make national priorities, security concerns interfering with the functioning of the internet. International sea waters, there is a big debate whether international law applies or not. Anyway, it's pretty wild in international sea waters, and that, of course, means that no regulation and security framework really apply, at least the national ones, and then we're going to discuss whether the international ones are going to be more effective. But these cables transfer data, as you will know, and transfer data between landing points, of course, but mostly between cloud services. And cloud services is another hardware dimension of the internet. So when we talk about how to protect this data, protect our data, regulate this data, we have to take into account that data are in the cloud, but actually are, of course, in hardware, physical hardware that are dislocated, distributed worldwide. And there is no single authority in the world that has any clue where all these cloud services are actually physically located. And this is relevant because when we talk about cybersecurity, our capacity to protect our data, we have also to acknowledge our limited capacity to protect this data because these data are somewhere that we are not fully aware where they are located. It's also relevant because we want to protect this data. We talk a lot, and probably that's what happened also over the last few days, about how important it is to strengthen national regulations. And this, of course, is very, very important. Drafting cybersecurity strategy, establishing a cybersecurity agency, this is critical. It's very important. But if these data are not located in the physically, they're not located under the legislation, under the regulation, where these regulations are actually effective, this means that we need also to be concerned how these other countries are actually equipped to protect the cloud services that are physically located under their own legislation and regulation. So these data are transferred because of technical protocols that are not negotiated by states, not by international organizations, but are actually negotiated by the technical community that most of the time represents industry. And they, of course, negotiate technical protocols that are, in their opinion, of course, as much more, would make the internet as much more functioning in the best ways possible. So all this is to say how is important of course, to, as we said, to strengthen national cybersecurity framework, but it's also very important to coordinate these efforts with international community. How important is to strengthen international cooperation, because we need to protect the internet, the functioning of the internet as a whole, beyond national capacities. And it's important also to go beyond the state capacity to implement the cybersecurity strategies, because, as we said, there are lots of representatives from industry and that take decisions on the functioning of the internet. They own cloud services, they own internet submarine cables, they intervene when submarine cables break. And so there are a variety of actors that needs to be necessarily involved into any strategies, transnational strategy when it comes to cybersecurity. This is pretty much what I'm going to talk about. Actually, I've been already talking too much about that, I guess. In the second part and conclusive part of the discussion we are having here today, I will also frame the concept of cyber capacity building that maybe some of you are, I hope most of you are already aware of, and we're gonna dive into this other critical dimension of international cooperation agenda in the cyber domain. So when it comes to international cooperation in the cyber domain, I'm sure that you have already discussed a variety of initiatives that are already available out there. I'm talking about the Budapest Convention, for example, that, have you covered the Budapest Convention? No? Not in the course, okay. I get for granted that you already covered, second, sorry? Ah, that was mentioned, okay, because that's actually what I wanted to discuss more into details. So anyway, we have the Budapest Convention, which is the most established agreements available existing when it comes to agreement concerning cybercrime regulations. But where diplomacy really turns into practice when it comes to negotiations concerning cybersecurity is the UN as being the home of multilateralism per excellence. There are two major initiatives that are happening in the UN context, as some are older than others. And I'm referring to two main initiatives. One is the UN Ad Hoc Committee, which is happening right now in these days, right in this moment. There is a meeting happening in New York where UN delegations, UN member states and members of civil society are negotiating the draft of the UN treaty, the first UN treaty on cybercrime. This is a process that has been, was launched, I think, 2 years ago and is going on for 2 years. There have been 2 meetings in Vienna, 3 meetings in New York, today being this week being the last series of meetings, in order to agree, if they will agree, on the draft of the cybercrime treaty that will eventually be approved next month by the General Assembly. Now, this process, which is probably the only process that I didn't really follow personally, it gives evidence on the difficulties that exist in the context of multilateralism when it comes to cybersecurity. Because after 2-3 years, there is not even agreement on the concept of the definition of cybercrime, something that we give for granted. What is cybercrime? But there is no definition where UN member states could agree about. And because it might be obvious to agree when it comes to EU member states, United States, there is a block of countries that tends to agree on certain issues, but then there are other actors, Iran, China, and so on, that they have a different understanding of crime. And this is very important because when it comes to regulations concerning cybercrime, is where usually is the evil is in the details. So what happens is most of the times that there are regulations and legislations that are trying to make the telecom sector or the digital domain as much free as possible, but there are details that falls under the cybercrime law. In some contexts, because it's easier to criminalize something instead than say upfront that is not, some certain initiatives online are not allowed. And this is problematic. For example, for some religious reasons, as a behavior online could be criminalized, for example. So it's difficult because, of course, there are different understanding of religion and so on. Anyway, we'll see at the end of the week what this draft version of the document of the treaty will be about. There is at the moment a lot of concerns coming from civil society organizations advocating for human rights, exactly doubting that the definitions that UN member states will agree on will really protect human rights online. The other element, the other initiative that it's great that you already heard about is a bit older than a UN ad hoc committee. I'm talking about the UN group of governmental experts and the UN open-ended working group. So the UN group of governmental experts was the picture is comes from one of the sessions. I've been part of several sessions of the UN open-ended working group myself, representing civil society, and the UN group of governmental experts happen through various 2-3 years cycles since 98. So you already covered that. Can I skip this part?
No, it's just my favorite topic.
It's your favorite topic. Okay, that's great. So, so I expect lots of questions from you. Yes, that exactly happened with various degrees of success or unsuccess. It depends whether you want to see the half full glass or half empty glass. And then the last cycle of negotiations in 2021 under the chairing of the Brazilian delegation. The UN group of governmental experts included 25 selected UN member states in order to agree on the first UN treaty on cybersecurity. Now, agreeing that the protection of the cyber domain goes beyond state capacity to protect the functioning of the internet, back to the idea that we can protect the internet only if there is ongoing cooperation with industry and civil society organizations. The UN launched also the UN open-ended working group, which was a cycle of, the first cycle of negotiations started in, as you can see from the slide, what was that, 2019, ended in 2021. The COVID happened in 2020, so it was postponed till 2021. And that included all the remaining, the leftover UN member states, including members of civil society organizations and industry. That was an outstanding achievement for the UN context, which, as we said, operates under a strict multilateralism format. And that was a great exercise, I'd say, that everybody would be able to contribute and to be involved in UN processes. So at the end of these 2 cycles, there was a document, everybody agreed, disagreed, and that happened. And then we had a new cycle of negotiations. The UN open-ended working group has just started again, and we are engaged in a new series of negotiations that we will end in 2025. So this is just to mention what is going on when it comes to international cooperation in the cyber domain. It's somebody is already passionate about. I don't know whether I managed to already raise your passion in the topic. I hope so. But it's actually, whether or not you got passionate about that, is actually very important, because that is what UN is doing, and it really frames the international cooperation in the cyber domain from a variety of angles. Now, there are lots of limitations. The limitations is that we know that the internet means many, many things. And the UN deals with the mandate of the UN, because of the institution UN is, deals with the state responsibility behavior. in the cyber domain, which is a very tiny specific mandate. And that's why there was the need to create another committee, the UN ad hoc committee, that was responsible to deal with specifically with cybercrime, which falls beyond the mandate of state responsibility behavior. Now, the other limitations is, of course, UN. There is a lot of discussion whether international law applies or not to the cyber domain and so on. The most important here is that UN, as we know how the UN operates, has limited capacity to intervene. And the only way to intervene is through sanctions. So if some member states behaves against the agreement, then is exposed to sanctions if the Assembly would advocate for that, would vote for it. The problem is that if you want to run a sanction, if you want to launch sanction, if you want to trigger a diplomatic crisis when it comes to these things, you need to be extremely sure that about the attribution of the attack. And attribution, I'm sure you already covered the challenges around attribution. No? No? Okay. Well, now I have only, they told me 20 minutes, so there is Prosecco behind the corner. I cannot go into those details. But attribution is, of course, a difficulty that we do have and in attributing a cyber attack. So we know that a cyber attack comes from somebody. We know that cyber attack comes, we might even be able to geolocalize the cyber attack, potentially, but we will, at this stage, never be able to be sure that the attack has been state-sponsored by a government. And when you say, who cares? But for the diplomatic equilibrium, diplomatic capacity that we have, this is crucial. Because without being sure that a state actor has run the attack, has sponsored the attack, we cannot trigger diplomatic tools. We cannot trigger sanctions. And so that, of course, limits a lot the capacity of the UN to turn the ambition into concrete actions. I mean, why there is Biden there? Because Biden, when the war in Russia started, he, I mean, now you remember the first days that there was this rush about showing muscles as much as possible, and then what happened was, if any NATO members will be exposed to a cyber attack, we will trigger Article 5, that for NATO jargon means we will start the Third World War. Now, that was a very strong statement, not very diplomatic, because, as we said, it's difficult, it's impossible to attribute an attack to a state. And this means that, are you really saying that you would start a Third World War without being sure that it was Russia sponsoring an attack? So that was a bit of too much, let's say. And indeed, luckily, nothing has happened because we don't have that capacity. And that says a lot, not only about the UN context, but says a lot about the diplomatic capacities, the diplomatic capacity we have to intervene in case of cyber attacks. There is another limitations that we have, is that the UN does not, as we said, covers state responsibility behavior. That's the capacity of the UN, and cannot deal with other things that we discussed about the routing of data, the cloud services, where these cloud services are located, and because these are, I don't know, mostly related to either technical solutions or trade agreements that deals with digital trade. And that means that that also limits a lot the capacity of the UN to set some standards, we could say, because these are dealt by other organizations. Of course, the WTO, for example, we know that all the digital trade agreements are formalized by the WTO, and the UN doesn't have any capacity to influence, rightfully, the WTO in their formalization process of digital trade agreement. So now moving into, how many minutes do we have yet?
6.
6. Okay. Otherwise, we're going to bring the Prosecco in the room. That wouldn't. So this brings me to the other concept that I wanted to share with you today, which is the concept of cyber capacity building, and has been mentioned already, why should we care about the cyber security capacity of the Global South? With this slide, these are data that I put together myself with my work, is the number of statements submitted in the context of multilateral negotiations as the UN Open-Ended Working Group. And as you can see, the number of statements submitted comes from the usual suspects. Well, of course, usual suspects plus countries that have something to say against the others, like Iran and China, of course. But most of the countries in the Global South are absolutely in that specific cycle of negotiations, not much active in didn't have a say on how issues supposed to be negotiated in the context of in the domain of cybersecurity. And so that is a problem, because if we say that we need to protect the internet as a whole in the context of international cooperation, we need to have a more holistic approach in addition to keep strengthening national cybersecurity capacity. We need to be sure that also countries in the Global South do have the capacity to, first of all, protect themselves, and after, or not after, but provide an active contribution to these ongoing negotiations that are happening in various contexts in addition to the UN. Also because, as you can see from this slide, it sounds obvious by now to say that most of the internet users are not located in Europe and in the United States. The only internet users in this small portion of the globe, there are only 25%, 23, 24% of the internet populations. And this data is going to change even further if you look at the internet penetration rate, because you see that Europeans and North America, internet penetration rate is the ratio between the number of internet users against the number of the entire population. And so then you see that the Europeans and North Americans most of the Europeans and North America by now are connected to the internet. But there are countries, in Asia, for example, where 50% of the internet population still needs to connect to the internet. And this means that when even that 50% will be connected to the internet, they will take probably the 80% of the internet population will be entirely located in Asia. And this, of course, when it comes to negotiating how the internet should look like, should function, will have a clear impact, the fact that most of the internet users are located somewhere else. And that's why one of the critical issues that is very high on the agenda of international cooperation in the domain of cybersecurity is cyber capacity building. Is the importance, the relevance of strengthening the capacity, as we said before, of countries in the Global South, not only to protect themselves, to protect the flow of data that pass through their piece of portion of digital infrastructure, but also to be able to engage with this ongoing conversation. So the capacity building is assessed through a variety of tools. The ITU assess cyber capacity building through an index, which is the, through an index, and that is an aggregation of availability of national cybersecurity strategy, a cybercrime legislation, whether they could rely on a national computer emergency response team or an agency. So there are a variety of elements that are taken into account. And in countries that still lack these critical elements, there are lots of investments in providing support to engage in to support to these countries to develop what is still missing. So now I have to go quickly. And the EU, back to the EU, and that's probably is an issue that you covered a lot. EU has invested a lot in this context. They providing support to cyber capacity building to partner countries through a variety of tools. This was the first EU cyber capacity building strategy that was a first document and methodology as well that the EU framed back in 2018 on how to assess what do we mean for cyber capacity building, how do we assess cyber capacity building in partner countries. That was the first effort. Last year had been released an updated version, revised version of the first edition. And the other document that is about to be released, that's why I don't have a picture about that, should be released, well, should have been released in December, but it's coming. Yes, the mainstream toolbox for cooperation project in partner countries, which is, again, is another strategy that you will implement through the delegations. I have to conclude. So, okay, give me just 1 extra minute. Capacity building is not a standard process at all, which is important when it comes to protection of a cyber infrastructure, digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure differ from country to country. Priorities differ from country to countries. So this means that the first stage, the first step when we aim to strengthen cyber capacity in a country, but probably in your own institutions as well, is why? Why should we care about strengthening cybersecurity capacity? Well, some countries do have some priorities, others country might have other priorities. Some countries, they deal with, I don't know, they have security concern because they are next to a hostile country. So this means that cybersecurity from them needs to be taken from a national, from a military perspective somehow. Others wants to develop a digital trade or digital economy, and that means that they need to focus on building a cybercrime legislation, for example. Anyway, there are priorities. That's stage one, frame the priorities. Then, based on the priorities, what capacities are already in place? Do we have a cybercrime law? Don't we have it? Then, if the priority is a cybercrime for us, then we need to focus on that. Anyway, assess the capacity that are already there. How we gonna to overcome, fix what is still missing, and that helps to frame the logic of intervention. And who? We give for granted that state actors are responsible to implement cyber capacity building initiatives. That's not always the case. It depends who's supposed to be responsible for that specific segment of responsibility for the protection of the cyber domain. And yes, that is important. And then what? And then it's a cycle. Now, concluding. So, when it comes to concluding on the cyber capacity building, that is linked anyway to our initial conversation about international cooperation in the cyber domain. Since 2018, when all the discussion about cyber capacity building was launched from European Commission, but also from many other actors, many initiatives have been taken, and now we could say that most of national capabilities are actually being implemented in most of countries, partner countries. Most of countries do have a cybercrime law, most countries do have their own agency, the Computer Emergency Response Team, but then there's a clear priority, and this is happening now, to go beyond the state capabilities to deal with cybersecurity. Because we say that the protection of the cyber domain is a shared responsibility, and this means that also other actors are supposed to develop the capacity to engage in the cyber domain. So a multi-stakeholder approach of the cyber capacity building, meaning industry, civil society, and so on. And now that we also increasingly established the fact that we need to protect the cyber domain as a whole, we need to strengthen international cooperation in the cyber domain, there is an increasing need to develop what we refer as cyber diplomacy capacity, the capacity of countries and actors to engage in the ongoing international cooperation in the cyber domain. This is basically what are the emerging priorities, what is very crucial in the current agenda of international cooperation in the cyber domain. And now it's time for Prosecco.